It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurczak, and this is the Kriya Yoga Podcast. 3, 2, 1. All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm here on the Kriya Yoga Podcast with a good friend of mine, Vishnu Dass, who is an Ayurvedic doctor-level member of the National Ayurvedic Medical Association. He's also served on the board of NAMA. Vishnu is the owner and director of Blue Lotus Ayurveda in Asheville, North Carolina, and also the lead instructor and dean of an Ayurvedic wellness counselor program in Asheville. And he's also an author of a book called Vishnu's Kitchen, which I will put a link in the notes of this podcast for you to find. And he also has an Herbology book, which for some reason I didn't know about. Tell me about it.
East and West.
East and West.
Ayurvedic Herbology, East and West. So
Okay.
It's a practical guide to Ayurvedic herbal medicine.
When did that happen? Did I miss that?
Oh, it's been out for, I think, like 6 or 7 years now. Through Lotus Press.
Wow, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No.
Well, good. So we'll put these books in the comments or in the section down below for information. You can find those. And the reason we're here with Vishnu today, Vishnu had a relationship with Roy Eugene Davis, which is my Kriya Yoga meditation teacher. And as I was talking to Vishnu a few weeks ago, he also mentioned that the tradition that he comes from also has a strong emphasis on Kriya Yoga, and so we consider him also a lifelong Kriya Yoga practitioner. So before we get into all that, I want to say thanks for being here, Vishnu.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, you have been involved in Ayurveda and spirituality for a long time, and you mentioned to me that your teacher also had a strong grounding in Kriya Yoga. Mm-hmm. So if you don't mind just telling me who your teacher was, what that grounding is, and what you wanted to tell me previously.
Yeah. Well, I think this is relevant to this conversation on Kriya Yoga because before I met my spiritual teacher, Baba Hari Das, I was recently, newly acquainted to yoga and had read a few kind of, just standard reads, like Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda and Play of Consciousness by Muktananda. So those were two books that I had torn throughout the summer that I had met Baba Hari Das. Mm-hmm. So I remembered being at Lama Foundation in New Mexico. So I was spending a few weeks there, and I was finishing reading Autobiography of a Yogi, and there was somewhere in the book, I forget where Yogananda had alluded to praying to Haryakan or Mahavatar Babaji. Mm-hmm. If you were an aspirant and you were wanting guidance and spiritual teacher, so I at least I got that message from the book. Mm-hmm. And so I started praying internally for a teacher. And within a short period of time, I wound up at a Hanuman temple in Taos that's associated with Neem Karoli Baba. And I was spending a couple of weeks there. And during that time, I met somebody who was instrumental at taking me further into Colorado that summer, where I met who is now one of my closest friends, Ram Priya Das, and he introduced me to Baba Hari Das, told me where he lived, and I wound up, within about 2 to 3 weeks or so from being at Lama Foundation, really praying for a teacher, at the feet of Baba Hari Das in Santa Cruz, actually Watsonville, California, at the Mount Madonna Center. And I still had really no understanding that there was some sort of connection on some level between my winding up with Baba Hari Das and my desire to learn Kriya Yoga, because in the Autobiography of a Yogi, there's so much mention of Kriya Yoga, but for some reason I never thought of just looking at the back of the book and calling the Self-Realization Fellowship in California. No offense to SRF,
right.
I just had no clue. It was off my radar. that page was blanked out of my consciousness. So I wound up at Baba Hari Dass's, and within a short period of time of being there, realized that after a few months of earnest practice of an introductory level class that was held on Saturday morning, and maintaining that practice on your own daily for 3 months, that Baba Hari Dass would initiate students in Kriya Yoga. And so I was excited. I didn't know anything about Kriya Yoga at the time, its relationship and connection with the Ashtanga Yoga system, or what Baba Hari Dass's main teachings were, which was Ashtanga Yoga and Bhagavad Gita and Yoga Sutras. So at the time I was philosophically very new at all of this, so I just did everything I was told, the practical method of Kriya Yoga in an introductory way, and then eventually being introduced to the first level practice of Kriya Yoga after 3 months. And over the next, the next decade from there, had increased my practice of Kriya Yoga through the various levels that he taught and initiated in. The practices were held secret and still are. They're not talked about publicly at Mount Madonna. People don't even mention Kriya Yoga unless you're a student and you've been there for a while. I mention it because I don't talk about the details of the practice, right. But I mention it because Baba Hari Dass has passed away about 1.5 years ago, and when people express desires to learn Kriya Yoga, I usually refer them to either Roy Eugene Davis's tradition and in CSA down in North Georgia. And now I can also send them your way, as well as for the folks in California, if it's convenient for them to go to Mount Madonna Center or to their in-town center in Santa Cruz, the Pacific Cultural Center, and get introduced to those teachings. Right. But what getting back to the Kriya Yoga aspect, I was eventually asked Baba Hari Dass about the origins of his practice, and if it had any connection to Mahavatar Babaji, because Baba Hari Dass wrote a book called Hariakan Baba, Known and Unknown. And Hariakan Baba, to be clear, is not the Hariakan Baba that was alive in Haldwani area of the Kumaon region of India, in the recent past. The Hariakan Baba that's known throughout that region was last seen physically in the villages working amongst people in like the early 1930s. Okay. And Baba Hari Dass grew up in this area, and all young aspirants of yoga were into Hariakan Baba, or they'd call him Hariakan Baba or various other regional names, and right. there was pictures taken of him and so on. But after that, he had been seen in villages. The last time he was seen, in visions, people's own personal visions. Okay. And Baba Hari Dass had several experiences where he was renovating small little roadside temples and little mandirs that you'd have, like little temples on the roadside that pilgrims would stop. And people, older men would come up and ask him or tell him that this was built by Hariakan Baba. And so that had happened several times where he had connections with renovate or restoring these old mandirs that were evidently first built by Hariakan Baba, right. Who is thought to be Mahavatar Babaji, and then once Baba Hari Dass had his own vision, or Hariakan Baba had manifested Baba Hari Dass when he was sitting in a cave and meditating. He was tired, and he had fallen over close to a fire that he had lit. And Hariakan Baba had come to him and lifted him up out of that, out of danger. And then as he looked at Hariakan Baba walking out of that cave, he saw some light coming from his back. And when he left the cave to see him, he was gone. So Baba Hari Dass doesn't talk about that kind of stuff much at all. So he had mentioned that in the book, and that there was somehow some sort of internal relationship. But when I asked him about the origins of his Kriya Yoga, he said that there's many Kriyas, hundreds of Kriyas within the Raja Yoga scriptures, and that these are, select teachings of Kriya Yoga that he developed. Okay, right. So this is Baba Hari Dass's yoga, Kriya Yoga methods were selected from the Raj Yoga scriptures specifically by him for his students. So it wasn't a lineage that was passed down from the Yogananda tradition.
Okay. So in the Yoga Sutras, chapter 2 is called Kriya Yoga. Mm-hmm. And weren't you telling me about a book that your teacher wrote that was specifically on that chapter?
Yeah, well, Baba Haridas has written extensively on all the books of the Yoga Sutras, and I believe they're all published now.
Okay.
The second book of the Yoga Sutras is the Sadhanapad.
Mm-hmm.
And so and there's a good introduction to Kriya Yoga in the Sadhanapad. Mm-hmm. And then that Sadhanapad gets into that, breaking down the relationship with Kriya Yoga and Ashtanga Yoga and so on. So it's a great book.
Right. We'll dig back into that in a minute. Let's kind of maybe go. I think it's in the future for you from your past. When you met Roy Davis, mm-hmm. What made you? How did you meet Roy? What brought that about?
Okay, and I want to say right off the bat that I do consider Roy one of my mentors and one of my teachers. More and more so, especially after he left his body. Like I would, Baba Haridas and Roy passed away both within about a year of each other, mm-hmm. and I've always felt that Roy was a bit of a gift for me, to put it lightly, because I moved from the West Coast to Albuquerque. I moved from living out west for a good chunk of my early adult life mm-hmm. to Asheville, North Carolina, when I was about 29 years old. Mm-hmm. And so I was separated physically from my spiritual family of California, and within about 2 years or so, I was hosting cooking classes at my home in Weaverville. Mm-hmm. And one of the students that attended that cooking class was Willie Davis, Roy's wife.
Oh, really?
And so I didn't know this, but towards the end of our cooking class, Willie, being the humble servant she is, really doesn't name drop or mention anything. She's quiet and really reserved, but she was a great student, and she wrote down diligent notes and was helping cook, and I could tell that she really was engaged in the class. And so at the end of class, she just came up to me and said, my husband is a Kriya Yoga teacher in Lakemont, Georgia, and I'm just curious if you'd be interested at some point coming down and teaching Ayurveda for our for our retreats that we do in Kriya Yoga. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was thrilled to be invited. And when she said Roy Eugene Davis, I lit up, because in 1996 I was living in Southern Oregon, and I came across a spiritual group, and I forget the person who hosted the group at the time. But what his name was, but there was a reading there was a reading and also a little bit of chanting in the Yogananda style of chanting with a harmonium, real simple kind of hymns and meditation. But I remembered hearing the reading, and it was just in plain English. It wasn't everything wasn't couched and embedded within Sanskrit, but it was just so rich. Mm-hmm. And I remembered asking the man who wrote this, and he said Roy Eugene Davis. And I remember he showed me a picture of Roy in a suit and tie, and I'm like, this guy's interesting. And so years later, one of my good friends at the Ayurvedic Institute, Win Warner, when I was at his house, I noticed he had a bunch of truth journals with Roy Eugene Davis, and in talking with Win, realized that he knew Roy back in California in the real old days. Mm-hmm. I think maybe even pre-CSA. Right. So when I met Roy...
Well, before you do that, about what year did you meet Willie?
This was, let's see, 2001. It was within around 2002 or 3.
Okay.
To about 2005. So I actually think it was closer to around 2005, because I think that was the first time that, and the dates could be wrong there, but it's pretty close to that, right, when I first wound up at CSA.
Okay, I was trying to figure out how how much your teaching influenced her cooking at the retreat centers from that point forward.
Well, Willie's a good cook, no matter what. And at the time she was, exploring some of the culinary arts of Ayurveda and the use of spices and going down to the center, I noticed a lot of those spices on her shelf, and right. I'd sat and eaten several lunches with Roy, Willie, and Kathleen and the gang over there, and she'd make khichdi or dal or things like that. So yeah, I think that there was, I would like to think that there was something that she took from that.
Yes, yeah. Good. And so when you met Roy, what was?
Well, when I met Roy, I would say it was interesting how all of that went about. I mean, there's a lot of stories to it. I'll keep it simple for now.
It doesn't have to be too simple.
when I met Roy, I had an interesting experience because I would be teaching there for 3 days. Each day for a few hours, I'd come in the afternoon and teach a segment on Ayurveda to the students. And each year that I would go back, or for each retreat, I started to notice a certain feeling within me that would last sometimes several days or a week or two even, where there was this, it was very similar to when I would go and spend time with Baba Hari Das. Mm-hmm. And especially during retreats when Baba Hari Das came to Mount Madonna to spend 4 days there, because he lived close by, he didn't live on the center. And whenever I'd be in Baba Hari Das's presence for 3-4 days during a retreat, I would go home with that feeling of just kind of being in the world but not of it. Just everything would just kind of roll off my back, and I felt great. Mm-hmm. And I had spent some time around some other spiritual teachers and at their ashrams here or in India, and Baba Hari Das had that unique effect that other teachers hadn't had on me. I guess it was just my own personal relationship with him, my own devotion to the path and his path. But when I met Roy, I wasn't a part of the tradition. I would just be in his presence, meditate with him for a half hour, listen to him speak for a little while before breakfast. And it was casual, and my relationship with him was always very casual because I wasn't his student. So I didn't have that shyness that maybe I would have had if he was my guru. Right. And so our relationship was just very low-key. Mm-hmm. But when I would leave, I would have that same feeling I'd had leaving Mount Madonna and leaving Baba Hari Das's presence. And so I noticed that Roy was a bit of a touchstone for me. Every time I would go down, I would feel more inspiration to practice. Mm-hmm. And that continued for several years that way, and it got stronger and stronger. Mm-hmm. And I was initiated in Kriya Yoga in 1992, and with Baba Hari Das, and had practiced his practices diligently for years. But when I met Roy, and after about, I would say maybe 3 yoga retreats there, Kriya Yoga initiation retreats, there was always a standing offer for me to stay for that Thursday initiation day. Mm-hmm. I think it was like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday do the initiation. Mm-hmm. And I would decline politely. And I think it was one of the last retreats that I taught for. I emailed Roy, and I had asked him if I could take the initiation. And I told him, I'm not looking for a guru. I'm not, in the market for a guru, but that I respected him as a guru. But my reason for taking the initiation was that Baba Hari Das's kriyas were so complex, and I'll just put it at that. I mean, unless you're living a life where you have the leisure to spend 2 hours doing practice every morning, just sitting doing pranayama meditation, it was hard to maintain it. Mm-hmm. And of course, Baba Hari Das always taught, well, you could do parts of it, you could do it incrementally. But I found that after the many years of doing that practice, that it was almost more distracting to me to try to do it all, right, even to cut it short. And Roy's practice, because it wasn't as secretive as Baba Hari Das's, I knew what the practice was before I was initiated into it. And I'm like, I want something simple from somebody that I feel is some way connected. And I felt that internal connection between Baba Hari Das and Roy. And Roy always had a real deep appreciation for Baba Hari Das. He would ask about him. And so Roy was thrilled. He was like, yes, absolutely, come, take the initiation. So I stayed for that Thursday. And I remembered walking into the main hall. And right before I walked into the main hall, Roy was out standing outside the door in the dining hall, greeting people as they walked in. And the first thing that he asked me was, how is your guru? How is Baba Hari Das? I've heard he's not been feeling well. And at that point, Baba Hari Das had some health struggles. And I was touched that he asked, and so we talked briefly, and then I went into the main hall, and I remembered at one point he was asking everybody to write down, some tendencies that you're wanting to surrender, to give up, to burn,
brain bowl,
to burn. In his chimenea homa, I call it, out on the porch. So I wrote down something, and as I was writing, what I wanted to offer to the fire, Roy just looked across the room, and he was collecting the envelopes at that point. He was up front, and he just looked back at me, and he winked at me. And he wasn't winking at the person behind me. He winked right at me. And when he winked at me, I would say that was probably the first time in my life that I had experienced what someone would call Shaktipat. Now, I had taken traditional Shaktipat with my former wife's teacher, and I had a lot of respect for them and everything, but it wasn't this mind-blowing and heart-opening experience. Not that Shaktipat has to be.
Right.
I understand it enough to know that it doesn't come with all the bells and whistles people think it may have. But with Roy's wink, I considered it the guru's glance. I was always like, I wish I knew what it was like to get Ramana Maharshi's glance.
Yes.
But Roy gave me that glance. And it was the same glance that Ramana would have given somebody. And I think even more potent because I knew Roy at that point and, well enough. And I trusted Roy, partly because he was just a no BS teacher like Baba Hari Das.
Right.
He wasn't one to say, I'll take your karma, I'll do the job for you, just surrender to me.
Right. Give me all your money.
Yeah. And I can appreciate deep guru devotion and guru yoga, but Baba Hari Das was more, the practical method like Roy. So that being said, I left that day, and I don't think I had anything other than just, I don't want to say a pure thought, but it seemed like my mind was placid, spacious, and quite empty. I remembered one man who was there at the center at the time was Nirvanananda. And Nirvanananda gave me several of his CDs and some of his music downloaded on a little MP3, a little zip drive. And on the way home, I was listening to Nirvanananda and just thinking about, contemplating my experience with Roy. And because the moment he winked, I just felt like I wanted to cry. I felt my heart open, but, I was able to hold it together. But I felt at peace at that moment. And it lasted throughout the day till I came back to Asheville. And I remembered getting back that night to to my clinic where I was living at the time. And I sat in the back room. The first thing I wanted to do, I just put my bags down and I just meditated and did the Kriya. And again, just felt a very close union with God, with Roy, and with the path. And so ever since then, I'd considered Roy and all of the students, my guru brothers and sisters around Roy, his family, Ron Lindon at the center. It just, I felt like they've been just an extended family, no different than any of my satsang out in California. Just that real close connection. So they were kind of like my spiritual home away from home, and still have served as that to me. I still visit. People connected to the center have developed connections and friendships with you, with Ryan Strong and others. So yeah, just been a real blessing.
So you mentioned, it's wonderful to hear that description, of the experience and the experiences that you had with Baba Hari Das, and you mentioned imagining what it would be like to have that kind of look from Ramana Maharshi.
Yeah.
And so I'm taking it that you're maybe one of those people that has the sense that this teaching or this spirit or this process can really come through any. It's not necessarily just simply the property of one organization or one teacher. It's like a universal thing. Yeah. And so you had a similar experience between your teacher and when you think about what you learned. We'll start with Baba Hari Das, then Roy again. When you think about some of the most important lessons you learned in your study with Baba Hari Das, and what comes to mind? What was some of the most important transformational lessons you got from him?
I think the first lesson that I learned from Baba Hari Das was discipline. And it wasn't discipline with an iron rod, Baba Hari Das was what I'd consider kind of a benevolent good guru in the sense that, there was really not a lot, there was no force. There wasn't even a kind of there was something alluring about him, just about his presence. Mm-hmm. But he didn't go out of his way to pull you in as a student. It was very much a self-led experience. I felt magnetically drawn to him immediately, and I knew I wanted him to be my teacher. Mm-hmm. But I was a latchkey kid. Especially from the time I was 12 onward.
So literally?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, I lived with my father, who at the time was kind of wild. And so I spent a lot of my time, as a latchkey kid, really just kind of taking care of myself. Mm-hmm. And that had some benefits and some drawbacks. The benefits were that I was free to, he was agnostic, and I had the freedom to think about what I wanted to be spiritually. So I dropped out of, Catholic Sunday school before I was confirmed, and I over the years, when in my late teens and 20s exploring spirituality, I was pretty open to whatever. I had a strong interest. But growing up, I didn't have a lot of discipline. Mm-hmm. So, meal times were whenever I wanted to eat, and often I had no discipline or, no curfew and so on. And when I met Baba Hari Das, I had the desire to learn, but I wasn't able to sit for 5 minutes without fidgeting or without feeling uncomfortable. I remember the first time that I meditated with him was 20 minutes, and I wanted to be in the front row, mm-hmm. right up next to him, but I couldn't sit up. So at the end, I was laying down, but I couldn't point my feet towards him, so I had my legs crossed, and I was laying down on my back. And when everybody was chanting Om, and I remembered sitting up really quick, and Baba Hari Das just staring right at me, just looking at me. And I could tell at that point, that was like the first time that I felt like he was kind of instilling that desire for practice and the need for discipline in me. And so what I thought was going to be a very peaceful stay on the mountain, 350 acres of redwood forest, became hard work. Yeah. He made it a point by saying that Mount Madonna Center was not an ashram, it was a working community. And it wasn't one of these places where everybody's dressed in white, pranaming each other, namaste, namaste. People had their own, practice was done on your own, mm-hmm. daily. If you wanted to. Some people didn't practice there. They lived there and were a part of the community. A lot of people did have their own practices connected with Babaji, who we affectionately call him Babaji. Mm-hmm. And during that time, I remembered, I think one of my first jobs was to thin some trees on a hairpin turn, because there was children who lived on the land. There was a school from preschool all the way up to seniors on the land, so there were kids on the road and everything else. So there was a blind curve, and we needed to cut down some redwood trees. And they were second growth redwoods, but this was a mature second growth forest, so the trees were rather big. Yeah. And so I was an environmental activist, Still am in my own way. But back then, I wouldn't even stir my tea with a wooden tea stirrer, okay? And here I am given, orders to go out with, not orders, but, my first job when I was there was to go out and cut trees.
A challenge to your idealism.
It was a big time. It was a hard day. And I was doing it with a big man named Mahavir. Big guy, Mahavir. He had the chainsaw. And he had this Australian accent. And I remembered Mahavir in his own kind of casual way saying, yeah, just take that down, and he was just kind of rough and ragged about it, And here I am, this idealistic, earth first hippie. And just mortified by the idea of chopping down trees. And so that was my first task, but I spent a lot of time working, whether it was moving rocks or digging dirt in the garden or working on a maintenance crew. There was just a lot to do. So it was at the time we could, the program there was like Karma Yoga program. You could work 28 hours a week, pay $60 a month, and you could live in the community, room and board provided. Mm-hmm. I just had to figure out how to clothe myself, how to get my laundry money, and how to save money to go to India. Right. So my first few years at Mount Madonna were all about practice, and I would philosophically, it was hard for me to sit through Sutra class and Gita class. I thought of myself as a bhakti yogi back then. For me, it was just being in nature and doing pranayama, meditation. I was more into the methods and the techniques and the practice than I was about studying scripture and sutra.
Right.
And so I would often leave sutra class early to just go work in the garden and chant Ram's name kind of thing, So that was in those days.
I can remember at CSA one time, Ellen Grace O'Brien was there teaching a Yoga Sutras class, mm-hmm. and I was sitting in the back, and it was halfway through, and I thought to myself, yeah, I think I just want to go outside. And I remember I left, and Roy was just coming in, and he says, you get back in there.
There was something to it that it took a while to appreciate it. Yeah. And of course, over time, I became more acquainted, formally with yoga philosophy. Mm-hmm. But I remembered after the first full summer and winter, mm-hmm. spring was coming, and I wrote Baba Haridas a letter. And Baba Haridas is silent. So for those of you who do not know who Baba Haridas was, he was a Moni, or Moni Sadhu, which means a silent yogi. And he wrote on a chalkboard. So our way of communicating often was either in private meeting, listening to him talk, or in class. But then there was also this time where you could just write him a letter, and he would respond within a day or two or three. Usually by the next time I saw him at Mount Madonna, which was several times a week he'd come, he'd hand me a letter. I still save all those letters, and they're great. One of my letters said, Babaji, I want to, in the mid-spring, I'd like to go to Mount Shasta for the summer and live on the mountain and practice. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. I'm going to go up the mountain. I'm going to have my tent, my sleeping bag. And at the time, I had traveled all over the country. I think I had hitchhiked across country several times since before then. And so I was free and easy wanderer at that point. And so being in one place for a year was my old road dog tendencies were kicking in, right. to wander. And so he wrote me back and he said, you can go to the mountains to meditate, but you won't learn yoga there. Mm-hmm. Is what he said. Mm-hmm. He said, you can go to the mountains to meditate, but you won't learn yoga there. He said, yogis go to the mountains and the crows bother them. So that was his old, the old Zen master type quote, couple sentence reply,
Right.
And that made me stay. Uh-huh. So he didn't tell me to stay. He just that was the directive though, mm-hmm. is if you really want to learn, stay.
Right.
And I spent the summer, but by that following winter, I was itching to go so bad that rather than ask him or tell them what I was thinking, I just wrote on a little piece of paper. I'm mortified that I did this, but I think it was a receipt from something I purchased in town. And I wrote a quick note saying, Babaji, I'm leaving for several months to go to the Southwest, to Flagstaff, Arizona, to visit some friends. And I wrote this little letter, and I told my friend to give it to him. I think it was during a New Year's retreat or something like that. I literally left when it was snowing. I arrived in Taos, New Mexico on a Greyhound bus in a snowstorm. It wasn't an easy journey to get there. And I think by the time that winter and spring was over, by early summer, I was back up at Mount Madonna again.
Right.
And that's kind of how it was for me. I was kind of a prodigal son. I'd arrive, I'd stay for some time, I'd leave, I'd come back and stay.
Right.
But all the while, Baba Hari Das always encouraged me to stay, to learn. And it wasn't until it was 1997, I finally told Babaji that I was going to move to Vermont. And at that point, I had been around him since 1992, and I had an inner conviction. I knew it was time to go. And he gave me his blessing at that point. It was the first time I think I had asked him or told him that I was going to go anywhere where he was just supportive of it. Right. And he says, you can go, and if you don't adjust to life in the out east, then you can just come back here. So it wasn't like, go, see if it works out, and then wander the world. He said, go, see if it works out. If it doesn't, come back. And I never went back to stay.
Right. That brings up two questions. The first one deals with how you mentioned that you weren't really inspired to study texts or scriptures or the Yoga Sutras and so on. Yeah. But I'm assuming you eventually did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me try to get all this organized in my brain, then I'll spit it out. And then the next one deals with this desire to kind of have to work through your discipline, and how in the beginning it took you a while to learn to kind of sit still and meditate, and how you kind of wanted to leave and wander around rather than stay there and do the practice. So my first question is this. To people who also have that feeling like, oh, I don't need to read the Yoga Sutras, I don't need to read the Gita, I don't need to study these things, I'm just a bhakti, what would you say to them? That's the first question. And then the second question is, would you have anything to share with individuals that really do have a strong desire or draw to learn and practice yoga, but really feel restless inside and don't feel like they can just, do what needs to be done to stay where they need to stay? Okay, so those are the two questions I have.
Okay, so speaking to the first question, Baba Hari Das's tradition is an Advaita tradition, but it's called but it's referred to as Vishista Advaita. Okay. So if I know you've read Yoga Vashista.
Yes, I have.
So there's a lot of practical method in there. Like the conversation between Vashista and Ram about grace versus self-effort, right? So Baba Hari Das would speak to both of those things. The self-effort would come through the grace would come through the self-effort in a sense. That when we could relax into the effort enough to actually learn to meditate effectively, and getting into the to those moments of grace. I remember Roy once said, "You can't storm the gates of heaven." You practice, and practice kind of it provides a ground for that grace to happen. I like to refer to that grace as that kind of natural inclination to let go, which in the sutras would be nirodha samskara. When we develop the tendency for restraint of the mind through meditation, then the nirodha samskara kicks in on its own. You can't force samadhi. Samadhi just occurs through the practice, kind of like as an organic process.
Is it like the idea of, for example, if you have the self-effort to build yourself a successful business, then the grace of good finances comes from that. Or if you take care of your body as best you can, then the grace of the best health you can have comes from that. It's a similar kind of thing.
Roy's idea of effective living, So in this way, the practice of bhakti and the practice of jnana, or that practice of devotion and the yoga of devotion and the yoga of knowledge, exists simultaneously,
right?
And that's something that when we study it, we're saying, well, what is our inner nature and which path should I follow? Am I a Jnani or am I a Bhakti? I like to think of Ramana Maharshi as a Bhakti towards his Jnana. Do you understand?
Well, he would always say that you can't, once you know the self, then you've got the devotion.
Yeah, the devotion to the practice, to that spiritual ideal. And at first, for me, I think that the philosophy was intimidating, because it was Baba Haridas's philosophy was heavily Sanskrit laden, and each sutra class, or for the Yoga Sutras, we'd go through only a handful of sutras, we'd chant them in Sanskrit, we talked about them in English, we'd break down each Sanskrit word, it would be heavily discussed. Right. And the same with the shlokas of the Gita. And so for me, being new to this, it was like all of this talk, in a way, was almost distracting, because I think partly because I felt that if I didn't understand it, then there wouldn't be any gain.
So for you, it was distracting. It wasn't just laziness.
No, it wasn't laziness. I was interested, but I'd follow the class to the point where I'd get frustrated. And I think part of that frustration was just being new at something. Okay. And then over time, hearing these terms over and over and over again, in class and in just like Q&A, the terms became more familiar, and I found how they were useful to me. It was in some respects, it was a way to frame what was going on in the practice and in my life in a philosophical way, rather than it being so random. Like, what is life about? Why is this happening? And and even within my practice, it gave me a language.
So studying those things helped put your life and the practice into context. And that was the benefit.
It was the benefit, because it wasn't just this kind of ineffable experience, or or left to my own interpretation in ways that maybe sometimes back then would have been somewhat ungrounded, or and so it provided a framework for my mind. And the Kriya Yoga, I remembered saying, well, if the technique isn't so important, because Baba Haridas used to say that yoga techniques are tricks, but they're important tricks. And part of me was, enticed to those tricks in a sense. I wanted to learn the techniques, but part of me was interested in the more direct experience that you'd read about when you'd read Shankara's work on, like Advaita philosophy or non-dualism. And so my practice, I would say, started off Bhakti, because Bhakti, at least from that kind of like Bhakti with form, devotion, where I was into puja and arti, like worship type practices, coupled with my Kriya Yoga practice. And then slowly but surely over time, at least for myself, I found less of an inclination towards what they would call saguna bhakti, or bhakti with form, to more what is referred to as nirguna bhakti. And then understanding Vishishta Advaita, I was taken by the how bhakti practices can be kind of a stepping stone towards that non-dual practice. And then when I started to study about the life of Ramana Maharshi, I understood that some of his first exposures to South Indian devotion were really inspiring as well. And so I started to realize that my tradition and the tradition of Baba Haridas came out of that Advaita tradition that I think it was Ramanujacharya who was the founder of that particular movement, where he was inspired by the devotion to Lord Vishnu in South India, but maintained that adherence to Advaita philosophy. So for me, Babaji was a perfect teacher, because he allowed a place for bhakti and for that jnana. And I would say that the practice just shifted and changed within myself over time, and my orientation to my practice changed, and still does continue to change.
Well, I think that's an important point a lot of people miss. You mentioned the idea of starting with devotion towards an object or a form. and then it eventually, for you, moved towards a formless kind of devotion. And I think a lot of people, they don't, when they try to imagine this formless kind of devotion, they just can't quite do it yet. And it's important to know that it's okay, if you need to use form, because that may eventually lead to a formless kind of devotion. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it could. And I remember once a bhakti came to Baba Hari Das. He was in the Gaudiya Sampradaya tradition, which was a Vaishnava tradition like ours, but worship of Lord Krishna. And their practice was would refer to themselves as blind bhakti. Like, they didn't want to consider God as non-dual. In fact, there was a little bit of rejection of that because they wanted to practice exclusive devotion to God with form. Okay. Once Baba Hari Das was asked by one of these students in relation to dual or non-dual realization, this devotee was adamant that his path was, pure bhakti. And so Baba Hari Das wrote on his chalkboard, "Then get that." and I understand what he meant by that. He's right. Like, rather than struggle with the idea of whether or not God is form or formless,
right?
He said, just go for it,
right? Because
ultimately it leads to the same place.
Exactly.
Like the story of Ramakrishna Paramahansa when he came out of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and his guru's like, "Why are you chanting Kali's name?" And he said, "Your Brahman and my Kali are the same."
Right.
And I think that's where it all kind of leads. That's why sometimes when I hear non-dual teachers naysaying Bhakti Yoga as if in some way it's not as high of a practice, right, or it's a dual practice, I like to say to suggest that it really doesn't matter. For me, it became a little bit more, I wouldn't say non-dual, but it became more formless form, than deity or something like that. Mm-hmm. Or even guru devotion. I recognize that the thought of my teachers, Baba Hari Das or Roy, they do act like that deity in, right, a sense to me. But my practice isn't solely around that, and it is, I would say, more kind of internalized, mm-hmm, from my practice. And so I don't like to look at it in a hierarchical sense, as far as that goes.
Right. I mean, in Vasishtha Yoga, I don't have the line memorized, but, mm-hmm, there's a statement there that you either treat everything as though it is yourself, mm-hmm, or that nothing is you.
Yeah.
And if you just pick one of those and stick with it,
the nothing and the everything.
Yeah, you get to the same, place. And I was reading "Be As You Are," referencing Ramana Maharshi, and he essentially was saying, you just recognize that everything is one thing, consciousness.
Yeah.
And if you're worshiping a statue of Kali or an idea of Kali, well, that is also consciousness. Mm-hmm. Just as if you're able to exist in a formless state, it's all, as you're saying, one thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Babaji used to say, if you could develop devotion to a rock, then that would work.
But what did he write on the board to that person? Because I think that's classic. He
was saying like, get that.
Yeah.
Like
quit talking about it.
Yeah. Or like, I don't think that there was anything that he could have said,
right,
other than that just say, get that.
Right.
Rather than saying, your bhakti is going to eventually lead to a non-dual realization of Brahman.
Right.
Because to the bhakti, at least in that context, that wasn't the desire.
Right.
And to think about it that way, in a sense, might cheapen the love for Krishna. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But on another level, I don't necessarily think it does, but for that devotee, it did.
Right. Well, when I heard it, what popped into my mind was, someone having this dialogue about, my bhakti is pure, and he's saying, well, get that, because if he got it, he would quit talking about it. He would just be it.
It can just get so into the semantics. I mean, I remember once, I hear this a lot when I look into kind of neo-Advaitin or neo-non-dual philosophy, is that somehow meditation is a dual practice and self-inquiry is not.
Right.
And I like to clarify that a little bit with people who are confused by that idea. And I think this is relevant because I do think the practice of self-inquiry, even though we may not look at it as Kriya Yoga, is a practical method.
Right.
Because I like to think of...
I have to get something in. So the neo non-dualism.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
Okay. I like to look at the practice of self-inquiry as starting off as a dual practice, because you are asking, who am I? The way that I practice self-inquiry, and that is a practice of mine, is to think of I, or to at least contemplate the idea of I as presence. Mm-hmm. So in Buddhist practice, presence is a big deal. Well, that presence is the I sense. And so Ramana would frequently say that it's not just repeated. Like, you're not just saying, who am I, who am I, who am I?
You really...
you are just leaning into that thought of who am I, but eventually dropping into that presence.
Right.
And in the first, that bridge between samprajñata samadhi with knowledge to asamprajñata samadhi is sasmita samadhi. And sasmita samadhi is where the I sense is isolated. Well, the practice of self-inquiry up to the point of sasmita samadhi is a dual practice. And so when we think of that, we can tame our mind into a kind of a quiescence and a spaciousness by contemplating the idea of self-inquiry. But that is maybe not as absorbed into samadhi as sasmita samadhi. So when I was talking to Baba Hari Das via letter about the nature of self-inquiry, he said, I forget his exact words, but he was talking about how unless the mind is absorbed into the I sense, until the meditator and the object become one, then there is still a duality within the practice. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not we say I, or whether or not we say Krishna, or whether or not we focus on yantra or mantra, they're all just what is compelling to us that we can hang the hat of our concentration on. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's where I find that sometimes it's just kind of a semantical game, whether or not we meditate or whether or not we do self-inquiry.
Right.
You know.
For some reason, the image came up in my mind of like tuning a guitar or some kind of instrument. You know, when you're tuning it, like say you're doing, what is it, the fifth fret to the next string. Mm-hmm. Like when you hear that like wobble, you know it's not in tune. Yeah. And then once you get it in tune, it's resonating together. So it's almost like the wobble is the kind of working. You're using the dualistic experience to kind of figure out, well, when is it actually in tune? Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense, but that came to mind. Yeah. So
in tune, right.
Right.
And you know, and a guitar will easily go out of tune.
Right.
And I notice with meditation, those moments of absorption into that space seems so natural. Like, oh wow. Why don't I just stay here?
Right.
And as soon as I think that, I'm into my thoughts again.
Right. right.
And at first, when I first was practicing, I found that I would struggle to hold that. Uh-huh. And it wasn't until after like a 2.5 hour meditation class with Baba Hari Das, we were all sitting there eating breakfast, and there was just that quiet moment after practice, and I was sitting there, and I noticed that I was in deeper meditation then, with my eyes open, just sitting there, than I had been for 2.5 hours. Mm-hmm. And the inner kind of self-manifesting koan that came to me was to relax the effort. Mm-hmm. And so that was just something that later on I found was a concept that you'll read about in different spiritual traditions around holding the effort and relaxation evenly. Mm-hmm. And to me, that really has been an important teaching for me, that one of the most potent inner teachings that have come, that when I'm practicing, is that I'm keeping the connection to that practice in an earnest way. Like, what is the quality of my attention and concentration in the practice, but also remaining soft and relaxed and receptive, rather than trying to kind of bull, forward.
So when we think about the idea of how, it took you a little while to kind of be able to sit up and do meditation, and you kind of wanted to go away because you were a wandering soul. Mm-hmm. The reason I'm curious about this from your perspective is, I've always personally been a very fixed, rigid person to my detriment. But for example, like when it comes to traveling, someone wanted me to go to Tiruvannamalai with them. And I said, fine, I'll go as long as we get in and we get back out. None of this backpacking around India and getting like malaria and food poisoning. Probably get it anyway. But so I've had numerous students and people that I've worked with that they seem sincere, like they want to learn. And they've even told me personally that they look at me as like a teacher figure, but they don't. They kind of come and they go, or they'll come in and they'll say, I want to learn, and I'll try to explain to them, okay, well, these are the things to do and so on. But then it's like they disappear, and then they... my question to you is, for you, did you finally just overcome that? Is it something that needs to be overcome, or...
I mean... Yeah, the range of aspirants varies so much. You know, when when the Yoga Sutras they talk about mild intensity, mild desire, mild intensity, mild desire, moderate intensity, and so on. And there's very few people that have kind of moderate to high desire and tendencies to practice. And for me, it's always kind of waxed and waned based on my life.
But you stayed with it, though.
I stayed with it, yeah, and I stayed with it even when I wasn't staying with it, in the sense when the proverbial shit hits the fan in life, and practice can sometimes take a back seat to just dealing with the day-to-day. I found that living life in the world as a yogi has allowed me to maintain my practice even when my formal practice wanes. And I at first that would have been a cop-out for me, because I hadn't been vetted by life.
Yeah.
The certain joys and woes of everything that go on, and all of the grief and the loss and the aging process, and so that's why I always say I'm always orientating myself to my practice. And there have been times where formal practice was not as strong, but my own psychological inner work was strong. And then when I'd come back to the practice, I would even be stronger for it. I had more tolerance for a lot of the aspects of myself that only life could suss out.
Right.
And so, and a story comes to mind that I think speaks to this. There was a really great yogi from India, from Gujarat, I believe, Dhyan Yogi. And I was associated with Dhyan Yogi's tradition through Anandima in it's about a decade ago. And that was a piece in the mosaic of my own tapestry. They were part of the same spiritual tradition that I'm from in India, but different lineage. So Dhyan Yogi came to this country at 99 years old. He traveled for 4 years all around the United States with his two close disciples, Anandima and Dilipji Pathak. And in traveling around the country, they were set up to do, Dhyan Yogi was set up to do meditation and Shaktipat initiations everywhere he'd go. Because it was a Kundalini Mahayoga, Raj Yoga tradition. So he did Shaktipat. And Dhyan Yogi had lived a life of obscurity in a lot of ways. And he wasn't wanting to make it big. The only reason why he was here at that age, and he was pretty healthy, could still do headstands and still walk vigorously. He used to say, walk with me, but don't try to keep up with me. He would just and he walked in wooden sandals, carouse, So, but he would say that even if one person shows up, then his mission is complete for that particular. And so a good student is kind of like. A good student, I wouldn't say good students are rare, but students that take a particular knowledge, like yoga, or like in my case, Ayurveda, out of maybe 24 students, maybe a few of them will continue onward to really practice Ayurveda and get out there and not just helping family and friends, or themselves, which ultimately is what I would hope, but maybe get into practice where they're helping others in the community and making it a part of their profession. So whatever way, the water, I would say the life water of that teaching of yoga seeps into their life. It may be something that comes later, you know, in their life.
Right.
You know, for me, it came early because I really wanted it. But then there was this whole, and I thought I wanted to be a sadhu and a monk. And I even was ordained as a monk and spent a few years doing that. But I had no idea the worldly life that awaited me. And other people, they go through life just kind of peripherally associated with yoga, and then as they get older,
that makes sense.
Especially young people. Robert Bly used to say, you know, Robert Bly, the poet and mythopoetic author and teacher, he used to say studying philosophy too early in life wasn't healthy.
Right.
And you know, I think, well, you know, if you're inclined to, like Ramana would say, if you're meant to do it, you're going to do it. Like, if you're meant to follow Gandhi, you're going to be following Gandhi. You're not going to be sitting here at my feet asking, should I follow Gandhi?
Right.
And you know, like Babaji letting me go eventually once I knew.
Right.
And, you know, so I don't know. I think that it's just one of those things that will come as it comes.
Well, it just, this whole conversation again reminded me of, you know, one of the things Roy always used to say to me was, you know, when I would travel and teach at Unity churches or when we had the center in Nashville, he'd always say, almost all the time, he said, remember, you're doing this as karma yogi, or as karma yoga. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. He's like, don't have any expectations about what happens after that. You are just doing it as karma yoga. So I guess it makes sense to just, well, that's how we're supposed to live our lives.
And you know, you know, we fake it till we make it because we want to be successful at what we're doing in life. In one teaching of karma yoga in a Bhagavad Gita class with Babaji, and I struggled with this idea of how do you remain detached from the, like, how do you practice disinterested action? Sometimes translation of Sanskrit just doesn't do it for me.
Right.
Because there's multiple ways we can look at it, but disinterested action applies that you're not interested in the work that you're doing, even though I know that's not what he meant. So Babaji clarified that, and he would say, karma yoga is done with great enthusiasm, knowing that you have absolutely no control over it.
Right.
And so, you know, that's why I say, you know, you throw yourself out there fully as much as you can, and you have, you know, and I think that you've seen that success with your Jyotish astrology, with all the work and all of the recordings and teachings and everything, and you know it's just taken years and years.
It just takes time.
It just takes years, and you know you gain a little bit of interest here and there, and over time it just builds and builds and builds. You know.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole idea of the karma yoga and what, you know, what your teacher mentioned. It's like doing the work without the anxiety.
Yeah.
You know, it's like when I think about planting a garden. Like, I love planting a garden. I love, you know, digging in the dirt and tilling it up and planting the seeds and watching it grow. But luckily, I have a grocery store down the road.
Yeah.
So I can plant it, and I don't have to be anxious about the fact that... So it's just doing it for its own sake, in a way, maybe.
Yeah, we're not Hopis out on the mesa watering by hand, praying for rain.
Right.
You know, people say, why do they put rattlesnakes in their mouth? It's like, because if it didn't rain...
Right.
There's no corn. And that was a big deal.
Yeah.
That the deeper level of surrender and devotion there.
Yeah. Well, when you think about, you know, kind of switching gears again back to Mr. Davis, you know, we talked about what was one of the most important lessons you learned from your first teacher. Well, with Mr. Davis, is there anything that comes to mind that sticks out to you that makes you think, this was a very important piece that helped me along my spiritual path?
With Roy?
Yeah,
specifically?
like your interaction with him, or his life, or just how he represented
the first thing that comes to my mind, and there's many things, you know, if I was to really think about it, but one of the first things that comes to me is Roy's authenticity and his ability to be able to put what he had out there in an innovative and contemporary way, in his own way. I mean, you know, I say contemporary in the kind of like 50s, 60s, 70s sense of contemporary, right? When he was like in a heyday of like building his platform.
Right.
And taking potshots for it, for being an innovator, in a sense. Taking teachings and rewriting them into his, I wouldn't even say rewriting them, exploring them from his own perspective, and finding his own meaning in those. Because we ultimately can read the same texts and sutras and we can interpret even Vedic teachings in so many different ways, and so I like how Roy presented ancient teachings in a modern way. He didn't come off as an orthodox Vedic teacher or with a Hindu coding on it. Not that there's anything wrong with that. For some, that's their path and the way that path. But for Roy, I just liked his kind of no nonsense and like kind of just ordinary way of presenting, and for me that was a huge teaching, because I came from a very I wouldn't say an orthodox way of studying yoga, but Baba Haridas was a conservative yoga teacher that way. If it wasn't in the scriptures, or it couldn't be linked back to the scriptures in some way, it wasn't much of what he taught. He was very much to the book, and that was his gift. He was a Sanskrit scholar, and he was a philosopher. And Roy, in his own way, in his own right, was too, but it was in the Western language. And so when I would read Roy's writings, it would speak to me just as much as anything out of a more classically written or traditionally written piece of work,
right,
like maybe coming out of Babaji's books. But all the wisdom was there, and using the English language to express it in a powerful way and in a direct way. And that helped me as an Ayurvedic teacher, because I wanted to present Ayurveda in a way that was both, clinical and medical for those going in that direction, but also really practical and day-to-day, just a real practical, common sense and way to incorporate these principles in our daily life. Not so they look like Hindu rituals of waking up in the morning and what mantras you chant when you get out of bed, and very specific routines and rituals that would go on in a Hindu household, all the karma kanda, taking care of family deities and the family puja, and how you prepare your food, and whether or not you drink chai or coffee or go to the bathroom squatting or sitting on a toilet seat. It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, I removed a lot of that kind of, what I don't want to call them trappings, but the external aspects, Ayurvedic food isn't necessarily curried Indian cuisine.
That's for sure.
Yeah, and and so we, especially if it comes from a restaurant here in town. No offense to the restaurants, but the residue that sticks behind after eating a nice buffet at an Indian restaurant. But that was a big one for me, is how to practice as well as teach this in a way that's just authentically me.
Right.
And that continues to be a journey in my own teaching style, to just kind of own that, and especially in the culture that exists today, where if you adopt too much of the traditional ways, you're culturally appropriating, which I kind of
don't worry, everyone in this room has been accused of that.
Because India is a mosaic and amalgam of so many different cultures.
Right.
Regardless to how you think about Indian history, we know that there's just so much sharing of information in spices, in trade, that goes back a long time.
In knowledge too.
Yeah, the Portuguese or Jews on the west coast of India, and the big trade that was going on there, or pre-Christianity Christians like Thomas going into South India, and and Mogul invasions and you name it, So I think of all of us as kind of a tapestry of humanity at this point. But if we adopt too much of those traditional ways, then in some ways, for me anyways, that didn't resonate. Earlier on I was more into that. And then as time's gone on, I feel like I call it youthing in a sense of, where am I within everything that I've learned up till now? Where is my practice within myself, with all my memories and all my own individual tendencies and my own expression of life? And in seeing that my spiritual path really is kind of a journey of both of those things. And I saw that in Roy a lot, where on one level he was a spiritual teacher that was completely and 100% dedicated to that practice, and he remained Roy in his own way, and that's what I love about him. Like, when I think of Roy, it brings a smile to my face that way, because he was just so much himself.
Right. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together, so thanks for ending on that note.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and I'll put your contact information again in the information section of the podcast. If you want to find your books or find your website or practice or your teaching material, they can find that too. But I just want to say thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.